Comparing colonial societies in the Americas. What the Europeans had encountered across the Atlantic was another old world, but their actions surely gave rise to a new world in the Americas. Their colonial empires, Spanish, Portuguese, British, and French alike, did not simply conquer and govern established societies, but rather generated wholly new societies, born of the decimation of Native American populations and the introduction of European and African peoples, cultures, plants, and animals. Furthermore, all the European rulers of these empires viewed their realms through the lens of the prevailing economic theory known as mercantilism. This view held that European governments served their country's economic interests best by encouraging exports and accumulating bullion, or precious metals such as silver and gold, believed to be the source of national prosperity. In this scheme of things, colonies provided closed markets for the manufactured goods of the mother country, and if they were lucky, supplied great quantities of bullion as well. Mercantilist thinking thus fueled European wars and colonial rivalries around the world in the early modern era. Particularly in Spanish America, however, it was a theory largely ignored or evaded in practice. Spain had few manufactured goods to sell, and piracy and smuggling allowed Spanish colonists to exchange goods with Spain's rivals. But variations across the immense colonial world of the Western Hemisphere were at least as noticeable as these similarities. Some differences grew out of the societies of the colonizing power, such as the contrast between a semi-feudal and Catholic Spain and a more rapidly changing Protestant England. The kind of economy established in particular regions, settler-dominated agriculture, slave-based plantations, ranching, or mining, likewise influenced their development. So too did the character of the Native American cultures. The more densely populated and urbanized Mesoamerican and Andean civilizations differed greatly from the more sparsely populated rural villages of North America, for example. Furthermore, women and men often experienced colonial intrusion in quite distinct ways. Beyond the common burdens of violent conquest, epidemic disease, and coerced labor, both Native American and enslaved African women had to cope with the additional demands made on them as females. Conquest was often accompanied by the transfer of women to the new colonial rulers. Cortés, for example, marked his alliance with the city of Tlaxcala against the Aztecs by an exchange of gifts in which he received hundreds of female slaves and 8 daughters of elite Tlaxcalan families, whom he distributed to his soldiers. And he commanded the Aztec ruler, "You are to deliver women with light skins, corn, chicken, eggs, and tortillas." Soon after conquest, many Spanish men married elite native women. It was a long-standing practice in Amerindian societies and was encouraged by both Spanish and indigenous male authorities as means of cementing their new relationship. It was also advantageous for some of the women involved. One of Aztec Emperor Moctezuma's daughters, who was mistress to Cortés and eventually married several other Spaniards, wound up with the largest land estate in the Valley of Mexico. Below this elite level of interaction, however, far more women experienced sexual violence and abuse. Rape accompanied conquest in many places, and dependent or enslaved women working under the control of European men frequently found themselves required to perform sexual services. This was tragedy and humiliation for native and enslaved men as well, for they were unable to protect their women from such abuse. Such variations in culture, policy, economy, and gender generated quite different colonial societies in several major regions of the Americas. In the lands of the Aztecs and the Incas. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec and Incan empires in the early 16th century gave Spain access to the most wealthy, urbanized, and densely populated regions of the Western Hemisphere. Within a century and well before the British had even begun their colonizing efforts in North America, the Spanish in Mexico and Peru had established nearly a dozen major cities, several impressive universities, hundreds of cathedrals, churches, and missions, an elaborate administrative bureaucracy, and a network of regulated international commerce. The economic foundation for this emerging colonial society lay in commercial agriculture, much of it on large rural estates, and in silver and gold mining. In both cases, native peoples, rather than African slaves or European workers, provided most of the labor, despite their much diminished numbers. Almost everywhere, it was forced labor, often directly required by colonial authorities. In a legal system known as encomienda, the Spanish crown granted to particular Spanish settlers a number of local native people from whom they could require labor, gold, or agricultural produce, and to whom they owed protection and instruction in the Christian faith. It turned into an exploitative regime not far removed from slavery and was replaced by a similar system, repartimiento, with slightly more control by the crown and Spanish officials. By the 17th century, the hacienda system had taken shape by which the owners of large estates directly employed native workers. With low wages, high taxes, and large debts to the landowners, the peons who worked these estates enjoyed little control over their lives or their livelihood. On this economic base, a distinctive social order grew up, replicating something of the Spanish class and gender hierarchy, while accommodating the racially and culturally different Indians and Africans, as well as growing numbers of racially mixed people. At the top of this colonial society were the male Spanish settlers, who were politically and economically dominant and seeking to become a landed aristocracy. One Spanish official commented in 1619, "The Spaniards, from the able and rich to the humble and poor, all hold themselves to be lords and will not serve or do manual labor." Politically, they increasingly saw themselves not as colonials, but as residents of a Spanish kingdom, subject to the Spanish monarch, yet separate and distinct from Spain itself, and deserving of a large measure of self-government. Therefore, they chafed under the heavy bureaucratic restrictions imposed by the crown. "I obey, but I do not enforce," was a slogan that reflected local authorities' resistance to orders from Spain. But the Spanish minority, never more than 20% of the population, was itself a divided community. Descendants of the original conquistadores sought to protect their privileges against immigrant newcomers. Spaniards born in the Americas, Creoles, resented the pretensions to superiority of those born in Spain, Peninsulares. Landowning Spaniards felt threatened by the growing wealth of commercial and mercantile groups practicing less prestigious occupations. Spanish missionaries and church authorities were often sharply critical of how these settlers treated native peoples. While Spanish women shared the racial privilege of their husbands, they were clearly subordinate in gender terms, unable to hold public office, and viewed as weak and in need of male protection. But they were also regarded as the bearers of civilization, and through their capacity to produce legitimate children, they were the essential link for transmitting male wealth, honor, and status to future generations. This required strict control of their sexuality and the continuation of the Iberian obsession with purity of blood. In Spain, that concern had focused on potential liaisons with Jews and Muslims. In the colonies, the alleged threat to female virtue derived from Native American and African men. From a male viewpoint, the problem with Spanish women was that there were very few of them. This demographic fact led to the most distinctive feature of these new colonial societies in Mexico and Peru, the emergence of a mestizo or mixed-race population, initially the product of unions between Spanish men and Indian women. Rooted in the sexual imbalance among Spanish immigrants, 7 men to 1 woman in early colonial Peru, for example, the emergence of a mestizo population was facilitated by the desire of many surviving Indian women for the relative security of life in a Spanish household, where they and their children would not be subject to the abuse and harsh demands made on native peoples. Over the 300 years of the colonial era, mestizo numbers grew substantially, becoming the majority of the population in Mexico sometime during the 19th century. Such mixed-race peoples were divided into dozens of separate groups known as castas, based on their racial heritage and skin color. Mestizos were largely Hispanic in culture, but Spaniards looked down on them during much of the colonial era, regarding them as illegitimate. For many were not born of proper marriages. Despite this attitude, their growing numbers and the economic usefulness of their men as artisans, clerks, supervisors of labor gangs, and lower-level officials in both church and state bureaucracies led to their recognition as a distinct social group. Mestizas, women of mixed racial background, worked as domestic servants or in their husbands' shops, wove cloth and manufactured candles and cigars, in addition to performing domestic duties. A few became quite wealthy. An illiterate mestiza named Mencia Perez married successively 2 reasonably well-to-do Spanish men, and upon their deaths took over their businesses, becoming in her own right a very rich woman by the 1590s. At that point, no one would have referred to her as a mestiza. Particularly in Mexico, mestizo identity blurred the sense of sharp racial difference between Spanish and Indian peoples, and became a major element in the identity of modern Mexico. At the bottom of Mexican and Peruvian colonial societies were the indigenous peoples known to Europeans as Indians. Traumatized by the Great Dying, they were subject to gross abuse and exploitation as the primary labor force for the mines and estates of the Spanish Empire, and were required to render tribute payments to their Spanish overlords. Their empires dismantled by Spanish conquest, their religions attacked by Spanish missionaries, and their diminished numbers forcibly relocated into larger settlements, many Indians gravitated toward the world of their conquerors. Many learned Spanish, converted to Christianity, moved to cities to work for wages, ate the meat of cows, chickens, and pigs, used plows and draft animals rather than traditional digging sticks, and took their many grievances to Spanish courts. Indian women endured some distinctive conditions, as Spanish legal codes generally defined them as minors rather than responsible adults. As those codes took hold, Indian women were increasingly excluded from the courts or represented by their menfolk. This made it more difficult to maintain female property rights. In 1804, for example, a Maya legal petition identified 8 men and 10 women from a particular family as owners of a piece of land, but the Spanish translation omitted the women's names altogether. But much that was indigenous persisted. At the local level, Indian male authorities retained a measure of autonomy, and traditional markets operated regularly. Both Andean and Maya women continued to leave personal property to their female descendants. Maize, beans, and squash persisted as the major elements of Indian diets in Mexico. Christian saints in many places blended easily with specialized indigenous gods, while belief in magic, folk medicine, and communion with the dead remained strong. Memories of the past also endured. The Tupac Amaru revolt in Peru during 1780 to 1781 was made in the name of the last independent Incan emperor. In that revolt, the wife of the leader, Micaela Bastidas, was referred to as La Coya, the female Inca, evoking the parallel hierarchies of male and female officials who had earlier governed the Incan empires. Thus, Spaniards, mestizos, and Indians represented the major social categories in the colonial lands of what had been the Inca and Aztec empires, while African slaves and freemen were less numerous than elsewhere in the Americas. Despite the sharp divisions among these groups, some movement was possible. Indians who acquired an education, wealth, and some European culture might pass as mestizo. Likewise, more fortunate mestizo families might be accepted as Spaniards over time. Colonial Spanish America was a vast laboratory of ethnic mixing and cultural change. It was dominated by Europeans, to be sure, but with a rather more fluid and culturally blended society than in the racially rigid colonies of British North America. Colonies of sugar. Another and quite different kind of colonial society emerged in the lowland areas of Brazil, ruled by Portugal, and in the Spanish, British, French, and Dutch colonies in the Caribbean. These regions lacked the great civilizations of Mexico and Peru, nor did they provide much mineral wealth until the Brazilian gold rush of the 1690s and the discovery of diamonds a little later. Still, Europeans found a very profitable substitute in sugar, which was much in demand in Europe, where it was used as a medicine, a spice, a sweetener, a preservative, and in sculptured forms as a decoration that indicated high status. Although commercial agriculture in the Spanish Empire served a domestic market in its towns and mining camps, these sugar-based colonies produced almost exclusively for export, while importing their food and other necessities. Large-scale sugar production had been pioneered by Arabs, who had introduced it in the Mediterranean. Europeans learned the technique and transferred it to their Atlantic island possessions and then to the Americas. For a century, Portuguese planters along the northeast coast of Brazil dominated the world market for sugar. Then the British, French, and Dutch turned the Caribbean territories into highly productive sugar-producing colonies, breaking the Portuguese and Brazilian monopoly. Sugar decisively transformed Brazil and the Caribbean. Its production, which involved both growing the sugarcane and processing it into usable sugar, was very labor-intensive and could most profitably occur in a large-scale, almost industrial setting. It was perhaps the first modern industry in that it produced for an international and mass market, using capital and expertise from Europe, with production facilities located in the Americas. However, its most characteristic feature, the massive use of slave labor, was an ancient practice. In the absence of a Native American population, which had been almost totally wiped out in the Caribbean or had fled inland in Brazil, European sugarcane planters turned to Africa and the Atlantic slave trade for an alternative workforce. The vast majority of the African captives transported across the Atlantic, some 80% or more, ended up in Brazil and the Caribbean. Slaves worked on sugar-producing estates in horrendous conditions. The heat and fire from the cauldrons, which turned raw sugarcane into crystallized sugar, reminded many visitors of scenes from hell. These conditions, combined with disease, generated a high death rate, perhaps 5 to 10% per year, which required plantation owners to constantly import fresh slaves. A Jesuit observer in 1580 aptly summarized the situation. "The work is great, and many die." More male slaves than female slaves were imported from Africa into the sugar economies of the Americas, leading to major and persistent gender imbalances. Nonetheless, female slaves did play distinctive roles in these societies. Women made up about half of the field gangs that did the heavy work of planting and harvesting sugarcane. They were subject to the same brutal punishments and received the same rations as their male counterparts, though they were seldom permitted to undertake the more skilled labor inside the sugar mills. Women who worked in urban areas, mostly for white female owners, did domestic chores and were often hired out as laborers in various homes, shops, laundries, inns, and brothels. Discouraged from establishing stable families, women had to endure, often alone, the wrenching separation from their children that occurred when they were sold. Mary Prince, a Caribbean slave who wrote a brief account of her life, recalled the pain of families torn apart. "The great God above alone knows the thoughts of the poor slave's heart, and the bitter pains which follow such separations as these. All that we love taken away from us. Oh, it is sad, sad, and sore to be borne." The extensive use of African slave labor gave these plantation colonies a very different ethnic and racial makeup than that of Highland Spanish America, as the snapshot on page 570 indicates. Thus, after 3 centuries of colonial rule, a substantial majority of Brazil's population was either partially or wholly of African descent. In the French Caribbean colony of Haiti in 1790, the corresponding figure was 93%. As in Spanish America, a considerable amount of racial mixing took place in Brazil. Cross-racial unions accounted for only about 10% of all marriages in Brazil, but the use of concubines and informal liaisons among Indians, Africans, and Portuguese produced a substantial mixed-race population. From their ranks derived much of the urban skilled workforce and many of the supervisors in the sugar industry. Mulattoes, the product of Portuguese African unions, predominated, but as many as 40 separate and named groups, each indicating a different racial mixture, emerged in colonial Brazil. The plantation complex of the Americas, based on African slavery, extended beyond the Caribbean and Brazil to encompass the southern colonies of British North America, where tobacco, cotton, rice, and indigo were major crops. But the social outcomes of these plantation colonies were quite different from those farther south. Because European women had joined the colonial migration to North America at an early date, these colonies experienced less racial mixing and certainly demonstrated less willingness to recognize the offspring of such unions and accord them a place in society. A sharply defined racial system, with Black Africans, Red Native Americans, and White Europeans, evolved in North America, whereas both Portuguese and Spanish colonies acknowledged a wide variety of mixed-race groups. Slavery too was different in North America than in the sugar colonies. By 1750 or so, slaves in what became the United States proved able to reproduce themselves, and by the time of the Civil War, almost all North American slaves had been born in the New World. That was never the case in Latin America, where large-scale importation of new slaves continued well into the 19th century. Nonetheless, many more slaves were voluntarily set free by their owners in Brazil than in North America, and free blacks and mulattoes in Brazil had more economic opportunities than did their counterparts in the United States. At least a few among them found positions as political leaders, scholars, musicians, writers, and artists. Some were even hired as slave catchers. Does this mean then that racism was absent in colonial Brazil? Certainly not, but it was different from racism in North America. For one thing, in North America, any African ancestry, no matter how small or distant, made a person black. In Brazil, a person of African and non-African ancestry was considered not black, but some other mixed race category. Racial prejudice surely persisted, for white characteristics were prized more highly than black features, and people regarded as white had enormously greater privileges and opportunities than others. Nevertheless, skin color in Brazil and in Latin America generally was only one criterion of class status, and the perception of color changed with the educational or economic standing of individuals. A light-skinned mulatto who had acquired some wealth or education might well pass as a white. One curious visitor to Brazil was surprised to find a darker-skinned man serving as a local official. "Isn't the governor a mulatto?" inquired the visitor. "He was, but he isn't anymore," was the reply. "How can a governor be a mulatto?" Settler colonies in North America. Yet another distinctive type of colonial society emerged in the northern British colonies of New England, New York, and Pennsylvania. Because the British were the last of the European powers to establish a colonial presence in the Americas, a full century after Spain, they found that only the dregs were left. The lands they acquired were widely regarded in Europe as the unpromising leftovers of the New World, lacking the obvious wealth and sophisticated cultures of the Spanish possessions. Until at least the 18th century, these British colonies remained far less prominent on the world stage than those of Spain or Portugal. The British settlers came from a more rapidly changing society than did those from an ardently Catholic, semi-feudal, authoritarian Spain. When Britain launched its colonial ventures in the 17th century, it had already experienced considerable conflict between Catholics and Protestants, the rise of a merchant capitalist class distinct from the nobility, and the emergence of Parliament as a check on the authority of kings. Although they brought much of their English culture with them, many of the British settlers, Puritans in Massachusetts and Quakers in Pennsylvania, for example, sought to escape aspects of an old European society rather than to recreate it, as was the case for most Spanish and Portuguese colonists. The easy availability of land and the outsider status of many British settlers made it even more difficult to follow the Spanish or Portuguese colonial pattern of sharp class hierarchies, large rural estates, and dependent laborers. Thus, men in Puritan New England became independent heads of family farms, a world away from Old England, where most land was owned by nobles and gentry and worked by servants, tenants, and paid laborers. But if men escaped the class restrictions of the Old Country, women were less able to avoid its gender limitations. While Puritan Christianity extolled the family and a woman's role as wife and mother, it reinforced largely unlimited male authority. "Since he is thy husband," declared Boston minister Benjamin Wadsworth in 1712 to the colony's women, "God has made him the head and set him above thee." Women were prosecuted for the crime of fornication far more often than their male companions. The inheritance of daughters was substantially less than that of sons. Few girls attended school, and while women were the majority of church members, they could never become ministers. Furthermore, British settlers were far more numerous than their Spanish counterparts, outnumbering them 5-1 by 1750. This disparity was the most obvious distinguishing feature of the New England and Middle Atlantic colonies. By the time of the American Revolution, some 90% or more of those colonies' populations were Europeans. Devastating diseases and a highly aggressive military policy had largely cleared the colonies of Native Americans, and their numbers, which were far smaller to start with than those of their Mesoamerican and Andean counterparts, did not rebound in subsequent centuries as they did in the lands of the Aztecs and the Incas. Moreover, slaves were not needed in an agricultural economy dominated by numerous small-scale independent farmers working their own land, although elite families, especially in urban areas, sometimes employed household slaves. These were almost pure settler colonies, without the racial mixing that was so prominent in Spanish and Portuguese territories. Other differences likewise emerged. A largely Protestant England was far less interested in spreading Christianity among the remaining native peoples than were the large and well-funded missionary societies of Catholic Spain. Although religion loomed large in the North American colonies, the church and colonial state were not so intimately connected as they were in Latin America. The Protestant emphasis on reading the Bible for oneself led to a much greater mass literacy than in Latin America, where 3 centuries of church education still left some 95% of the population illiterate at independence. By contrast, well over 75% of white males in British North America were literate by the 1770s, although women's literacy rate was somewhat lower. Furthermore, British settler colonies evolved traditions of local self-government more extensively than in Latin America. Preferring to rely on joint stock companies or wealthy individuals operating under a royal charter, Britain had nothing resembling the elaborate imperial bureaucracy that governed Spanish colonies. For much of the 17th century, a prolonged power struggle between the English king and Parliament meant that the British government paid little attention to the internal affairs of the colonies. Therefore, elected colonial assemblies, seeing themselves as little parliaments defending the rights of Englishmen, vigorously contested the prerogatives of royal governors sent to administer their affairs. The grand irony of the modern history of the Americas lay in the reversal of long-established relationships between the northern and southern continents. For thousands of years, the major centers of wealth, power, commerce, and innovation lay in Mesoamerica and the Andes. That pattern continued for much of the colonial era, as the Spanish and Portuguese colonies seemed far more prosperous and successful than their British or French counterparts in North America. In the 19th and 20th centuries, however, the balance shifted. What had once been the dregs of the colonial world became the United States, more politically stable, more democratic, more economically successful, and more internationally powerful than a divided, unstable, and much less prosperous Latin America.